to talk about action guidance about addressing an inhalational anesthetic pollution. And thankfully, thanks to other speakers, I don't have to cover some of the background. There we go. It's just a delay, like you said. Okay, so my interest began during my residency training. I was so excited to finally find a profession that really spoke to my heart. It's very exciting taking care of patients for the first time, but it's really obvious we're wasting so much stuff. Our stuff is coming from somewhere, it's going from somewhere, must be causing some harm to the environment. And so I started to ask the question of what is the harm that our care is doing and how can we do better? And so really starting to expand what we think about our duty from taking care of patients to taking care of public health and planetary health, because we are dependent on the environment. Okay, some disclosures. I do have some grants from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, the Commonwealth Fund, and also I serve as faculty for the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. None of that will affect this talk. Okay, let's see if this, I'm going to lose some time on this, but nope. Nope. Yes. Okay, so our work with the Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change has been tracking the global contribution of healthcare to pollution, to greenhouse gas emissions since 2019. It's an annual report. Healthcare is an enormous part of the global economy, 10%. And what we found is that healthcare is responsible for over 5% of total global greenhouse gas emissions. And I know this is an international group, but I have to point out that the US is an outlier here and not in a positive way, highest per capita greenhouse gas emissions. Now, if we had the greatest health outcomes for that, there might be some tolerances until we figure out greener ways of producing things. Next slide, please. So we started associating per capita healthcare greenhouse gas emissions, which you see on the x-axis and on the y-axis, with some measure of health system performance. In this case, the Healthcare Access and Quality Index of the Institutes for Healthcare Improvement. Each year, we've been looking at different metrics and find the same thing. At around 400 kilograms of CO2 equivalents, it's about the maximum healthcare access and quality performance, health system performance. And so we have a positive representation here. Sorry. Pointer's not working, trying to do it manually. So it's okay. Positive representation, for example, by France. You see a lot of the European regions, but some outliers here. Again, USA an outlier. And we know that 1/4 of services globally are deemed inappropriate or low value, and about half the world lacks access to healthcare. And so what this means is that we have to elevate, obviously, the quality of care in many parts of the world and also reduce emissions in other parts. And the good news is that there are examples to draw from. Next slide, please. And so even though we'll be talking a lot about greenhouse gas emissions, there are other types of pollution of concern. We looked at national health sector national health sector pollution in the United States. We're about healthcare is about 8.5% of national greenhouse gases here in the United States, similar fractions of air pollution because it's mostly stemming from fossil fuel combustion. If you combine greenhouse gas and non-greenhouse gas emissions, health damages, we lose about 388,000 disability adjusted life years annually, especially from air pollution. We'll come back to that. We looked at essentially the health damages as first reported from medical errors in the Institute of Medicine report. We found that the damages from healthcare pollution in the United States are about similar in magnitude. And why that matters is that when this publication first came out in the United States, and forgive me for being so centric here at an international meeting, but hopefully you are familiar with this report because it sparked the whole patient safety movement. And of course, our profession have been leaders in this front. We thought we were doing things safely before this report came out. And then when those damages were quantified, we realized we needed to do a better job, sparked entire structures and systems for trying to prevent medical errors and do things safely. And so healthcare pollution is on the same order of magnitude as medical errors as first reported by the IOM. And what we're trying to say is that pollution prevention is the new patient safety movement. Next slide, please. In order to mitigate healthcare pollution, we need to know where those emissions are coming from. So this is a relative breakdown. This one's from the NHS. The breakdown is really quite similar for other studies, including at the hospital level, at the national level. And importantly, some takeaway themes is that the vast majority of emissions are coming from the supply chain, the goods and services that we use to deliver the care, especially from pharmaceuticals and chemicals and medical equipment, things that we have direct control over as clinicians. And inhaled anesthetics, about 3% of the nation's health sector emissions in the UK. And in the US, I'm guessing it's a little smaller. We don't have the same data that they do. Nonetheless, it's still a big fraction of national emissions. Now, there are a couple of papers out there estimating that total global greenhouse gas emissions from inhaled anesthetics are around 0.01, I'd say closer to 0.1%. There's a lot of challenges in making those estimations. But there are those that say, that's small, why should we care? Firstly, that's coming just from one thing that we use, one profession, maybe in laboratory medicine as well, veterinary medicine, but something we have direct purview over as clinicians. And there are now studies also show that 5% of a hospital's emissions are coming just from inhaled anesthetics. And if you delve down to perioperative services, half the emissions from perioperative services, including the energy to run the HVAC systems, to run all the complex medical equipment, including all the surgical supplies, half those emissions are coming from inhaled anesthetics. We have the ability to make a difference. Next slide, please. And so I've been tasked, so what are we going to do about it? I'm going to present what the ASA Committee on Environmental Health has been recommending for years now from our anesthesiology sustainability checklist. The first thing on that checklist is to reduce inhaled anesthetic atmospheric waste. And the strategies include utilize low fresh gas flows, avoid high impact anesthetics, death rain, and nitrous oxide when safe to do so. Consider intravenous and regional techniques, again, when safe, when appropriate. And decommission, avoid installation of nitrous oxide centralized piping, substitute portable tanks that remain closed between uses. And then we'll talk very briefly about waste anesthetic gas trapping or destruction technology, which really should only be considered after everything else has been done first. And I would argue we shouldn't do this last one, but it's on the list. So the rest of the talk, I'm going to be going through each of these. Next slide, please. Next slide. So thankfully, you've heard about low flows all day. You are all more expert than I am, I'm sure. This was a different way of presenting information. First presented by Susan Ryan in her Anesthesia and Analgesia 2010 publication, which is comparing 1 MAC of anesthesia for these different gases and at different flow rates. And for nitrous oxide, she only did it at 0.6 because obviously we can't do a full MAC of nitrous oxide. So the two take-home messages here are really clear: higher fresh gas flows, more pollution, and dust strain and nitrous oxide, again, 0.6 MAC, worse from an environmental perspective. And this is being presented as equivalent miles driven from an hour of anesthetic. And so it's really helpful mentally to be thinking about things in a way that we can relate to. We can also do the same thing with kilometers. But the bottom line is that it's much easier to think about dust rain, for example, 1 hour dust rain at 10 liters, which hopefully you're not doing. It's like the equivalent of driving 1,900 miles. And obviously, take-home messages include, don't forget to turn your fresh gas flow rates down. Next slide, please. So, of course, there's been the FDA package insert limiting fresh gas flow rates to 2 liters per minute for for use over 2 MAC hours and never to go less than 1 liter per minute. Unsure how that has been adopted across the world. In many countries, it has never been adopted, but it's certainly been a practice that has been adopted in the United States. And the Committee on Equipment and Facilities here at the ASA, some of our members, and also the Committee on Environmental Health, really considered how we might change this, because there's not been any demonstrated harm from nephrotoxicity due to compound A. And so we talked about, do we work with the FDA to try and change that black box warning? And the short story is, we thought that the most expeditious way to try and alleviate any concerns about using low flow SIVO anesthesia is to do a statement officially from the American Society of Anesthesiologists. So we recently published this article, Low Flow Sevoflurane is safe, economical, and better for the environment. And hopefully by the end of this meeting, this statement will have passed. Essentially, you can use whatever flows you want, provided you have safety measures in place, as Dr. Feldman presented. And we hope that this will alleviate any concerns about practicing low flow anesthesia. Next slide, please. Something to encourage low flow anesthesia are real-time fresh gas alerts at the point of care. Here's an example from my own institution. It's a pop-up warning, which, you can get very distracted at the beginning in case, forget to turn your flows down. And this has been really quite helpful in our own institution. And it's not new. I think there was a publication more than 10 years ago that AIMS, and I forget the acronym, but so it's been around for a while, but these are becoming more and more popular, that and it's helping to affect behavior change, especially if you really provide some guidance on what the limit is okay. In this case, we agreed across our health system at 1 liter. We did this a few years ago before this statement, so it took a lot of convincing. Next slide, please. This is a recent publication out of UCSF, where they instituted a fresh gas flow alert back in 2018 that popped up at greater than 1 liter for sevoflurane and greater than 0.7 liters for desflurane. And they found a mean decrease of 0.6 liters per minute on average. And I will say, it depends on what your starting point is. Their starting point was pretty low to begin with. When I started at Yale, every single OR I walked into, the fresh gas flow liters were a total of 5 liters per minute. 3 of air, 2 of oxygen, try and get a nice number of 50%. We did look at the national data from the ASA, sorry, I'm blanking on the name, the national quality data, and found something similar. The average maintenance fresh gas flow was at 5 liters per minute. It's really quite shocking, but so it's not uncommon. So it depends on what your baseline is to begin with. After 2019, they got rid of desflurane and changed their fresh gas flow alert to 0.7 overall. Next slide, please. So next point, avoid high impact anesthetics, desflurane and nitrous oxide. Next slide. So we've already shown this. We don't need to spend too much time on this, other than I just want to point out that this is just based on the global warming potential of inhaled anesthetics, the waste anesthetic gas only. So my research partner and I asked the question, well, what about the life cycle of those emissions, meaning the manufacturing of the medications, the transportation, the packaging, and what happens at waste disposal phase? Is it really safe to say that these emissions are much higher for desflurane and nitrous oxide? And what about an alternative like propofol? Next slide, please. And so we applied an environmental engineering model called life cycle assessment, which is a tool for quantifying total resource inputs and burdens over the entire life cycle of a product. Next slide, please. Excuse me. Next. Yes, this has animation. So you can keep going. Yep. One more. Stop there. Thank you. So we tend to think about stuff when we use it, but we tend to think less about what happens when we make it, and even less about the natural resource extraction. And maybe we think about stuff when we throw it away. But you need to consider all the inputs and outputs to be able to make fair comparisons between a product or process. And it's not always intuitive. For example, for intravenous medications, most of the emissions are coming from the production stage. For gases, they're at the emissions stage. And even though we're talking a lot about greenhouse gas emissions, you have to consider multiple environmental impacts and make sure we're not just exchanging one problem for another. And this technique is used to quantify emissions to help design improvements and also decision support, like procurement decision-making or even clinical decision-making. Next slide, please. And so this is from our 2012 publication. There's a lot of information here. Assuming 1 MAC equivalent of these medications, desflurane at 1 liter and sevoflurane at 1 liter per minute, isoflurane, because of the time of the study more than a decade ago, we did assume 2 liters of sevoflurane, but imagine if it were just 1 liter based on that table. But some takeaways here, if you just squint, the light pink there, that's representing the volatile. So the MAC equivalent footprint of desflurane is about 20 times that of isoflurane at the same fresh gas flow, and would be about 40 times that of sevoflurane at the same fresh gas flow. Nitrous oxide, if you took 60% nitrous and only 40% of the volatile, you can see nitrous oxide is nearly as bad as desflurane in clinically equivalent doses. And you can't see propofol on this slide. It's not because it's not there. It's because the life cycle emissions are several orders of magnitude fewer. And if you were to expand this portion of the graph, you would see, as I said, most of the emissions from propofol are coming from the manufacturing stage. And most of the emissions from the inhaled anesthetics are coming from the waste phase, what's being thrown out. Next slide, please. So this information led us to get our procurement officers to get rid of desflurane from our hospital formulary back in 2013. There was also a big cost argument, saved our health system $1.2 million because desflurane was also the most expensive. And that was after substituting sevoflurane for those cases. The equivalent of 360 cars off the road, and this is just 1 year. I'm now proud we're more than a decade later, and I can multiply that and feel very proud. After I worked, Kaiser Permanente, which is one of the largest health systems in the United States, phased out desflurane starting in Northern California in 2017. As I'm sure many of you in this audience are aware, the European Union now has a ban as of 2026, England 2024, Scotland is phasing out now. There may be some people in this audience who are not happy about that. There's nothing clinically unique about desflurane that cannot be achieved by other medications. And in terms of turnover rate, how much faster does one need to turn over a room? The finesse of our profession is when the case is over, the drapes come down, the eyes open up, regardless of the anesthetic that we use. Next slide, please. So next point, consider intravenous and regional techniques. Next slide. So we then hypothesized, well, those were just those individual medications. What if you put everything together that we use, all the plastics, all the metals, reusable and disposable, all the drugs, and compared them? Our hypothesis was that any anesthetic approach that used an inhaled anesthetic would be worse from an environmental perspective. And if you squint at this, this is what we showed, the purple being inhaled anesthetic. My colleague Forbes McGain published a similar article back in 2021, showing something very similar, although he did not parse out the intravenous purely from the inhaled. Next slide, please. And so what about non-greenhouse gas emissions? This was actually part of our original 2012 submission to ANA, and this was the first time a life cycle assessment study was submitted to an anesthesia journal. I'm not sure about even a medical journal. We were asked to remove all the data other than greenhouse gases because the reviewers did not have the competence to review. We're now updating this because it's a decade later, but I just want to show you that the non-greenhouse gas life cycle emissions from general anesthetics, a common concern is that propofol is toxic to the environment and therefore we don't know which is better. It's a different metric. I said we were talking about greenhouse gases or other emissions of concerns. And so these are some standard impact categories in environmental engineering, carcinogenic, non-carcinogenic, respiratory effects. And you see propofol is still the least harmful from these other environmental perspectives. Next slide. And so this is also a different study. It was actually a Delphi study of experts looking to rank environmental impact categories of importance over time horizons, long, medium, and short term. And in the short term, the primary concern is actually air pollution. That is the thing that's going to be most detrimental to human health. In the intermediate term, it's global warming. And in the longer term, you can see also global warming. Ecotoxicity is ranked lower. It's not to say it's not important. It's when we think about all the challenges to human health from pollution, how do we rank? So there's no such thing as a green anesthetic, an environmentally friendly anesthetic. It is the environmentally preferable anesthetic, which one is least harmful to the environment and human health. Next slide, please. So decommission, avoid installing nitrous oxide centralized piping, and substitute portable tanks that remain closed between loops. You heard part of this from my previous speaker. It has been found independently by different observers on 3 different continents that between 70 and close to 100% of nitrous oxide is lost pre-utilization through the piping systems. Notably at the connections, the manifolds where the tanks connect to the piping. So if you ask your building engineers, they say, we check those pipes, they don't leak. The pipes may not leak, but the manifold connections do. Next slide, please. And so this is what everyone's doing. They're looking at, let's look at what we're buying and let's look at what we're using. So this is from my own institution, our main different hospital systems, and what we're buying and what we're using. So procurement, electronic health records. And I was able to confirm at my own institution, one is doing a little bit better here. Overall, 95% losses in my own institution. We're spending about $260,000 a year. 95% is being just thrown away. The equivalent of over 12 million miles driven. Next slide, please. And so the recommendation is, well, firstly, do you really need nitrous oxide? One could argue, perhaps in pediatrics we use it. Even then, there are many hospitals, even pediatric ones, that are choosing to no longer use nitrous oxide. I'm not saying get rid of it. I'm saying be more frugal about it. So you can have the portable tanks on the anesthesia machines. They should be closed between uses or have a protocol that closes them at the end of the day because they will also leak. That said, many of us got rid of this feature on our anesthesia machines and have been challenged. If you want to retrofit it now, we were told $5,000 per machine. We have something like 130 different operating locations. That's not feasible. And so we're looking using electronic record to see where we're actually using the drug the most. And we're saving $250,000. We can afford to retrofit a few machines strategically. Next slide, please. So consider investing in waste anesthetic gas trapping for volatiles only, waste destruction, nitrous only technology, only after the aforementioned interventions are maximized and institutional cost benefit analysis performed. Next slide, please. So this is just a summary slides of all the different types of waste anesthetic gas treatment. Well, no. This is a charcoal filter that is commonly used in locations that don't have vacuum systems, the scavenging systems. So to protect against occupational exposure, these work for volatiles. The volatile gets condensed or it's absorbed and then it turns into a liquid, and then this gets tossed into the trash. And then what happens? It just goes back into the environment. So it helps protect against indoor occupational exposure. That's its job, but this doesn't solve our problem. And it just works for volatiles. Photochemical air purification, so destruction technology. These are all commercially available, by the way. The commercially available is only for nitrous oxide, although it could technically destroy volatiles as well. And if I were to invest in some technology, I would invest in this for all, to get it does it all. Gas capturing systems, that only works for volatiles. So there are a couple of different systems that adsorb and condense but then they have to be repurified, separated. In North America, there's a company in Canada. So there are organizations here in California that will ship their captured gas all the way back to Toronto area. And it's not approved for reuse in the United States. I don't know about Europe. There was some approval, I think, of Desrain. Why was that the first drug that they went after? You tell me. In Canada, but it's not approved for reuse in most parts of the world. So then what happens? They store it or they incinerate it. One of the two is happening. So in theory, you could say, is it a solution that we could go after? Well, then we have this other problem, and that only what is scavenged is potentially treatable. In the case of nitrous oxide, particularly in laboring women and for analgesia, a lot of gas is not getting to the scavenging system. In terms of volatile anesthetics, we know we have patients that we mask induce mask ventilation during the case. Of course, that is more common in pediatrics. Leaks around the LMA, Jeff said not really a problem. Still, patients are off gassing at least 20% after anesthetics. So there's a question about how much is actually getting to the circuit. And then the efficiency of these treatment technologies have not been independently verified. There's one really great study by Rauschenwald that looked at nitrous oxide using this photochemical air purification in an experimental setting, and found at high flows, the efficiency went way down, which makes sense because the treatment time is reduced. And by high flows, it was 2 liters. So I think a lot more information is required before going this way. And my own personal concern is that, like our plastic bottles and to-go cups, industry said, you can recycle it, it'll all be okay, it's not a problem. My fear is if we start instituting this technology, behaviors will not change. And so that's why everything else should be done first. Next slide, please. Should know, here in the United States, the Joint Commission, one of our largest oversight bodies, has developed a proposed environmental standard, and now they have an elective certification. This is a step towards making a requirement to reduce healthcare pollution, greenhouse gas emissions. And one of the 6 proposed measures is on inhaled anesthetic, anesthetic gas use. And that is based on the advocacy work of our group. Next slide, please. And so it's really important. Every department should be benchmarking their emissions. Every department should be providing feedback to the department, to individuals. The simplest way to just audit the procurement records, just look at everything you're buying. And then you can normalize it somehow. Several studies have normalized by case volume. It's a little tricky to do it that way. Case hours are even better. We track that pretty closely in the United States. And if we had to choose one measure, one normalization measure that we can all agree upon, I would propose case hours is the best one. And then you can track your department level performance over time, instituting some of these teachings and measures. If you have electronic health records, you can actually delve down to the individual provider. You look at different phases of anesthetic. It's more complicated. I'm not sure. I think it gets a bit more esoteric when you get down there. These large concepts and behavior changes are really what matters, but you can do individual provider reports. You can do it by specialty group. Here is some of the performance on nitrous oxide usage in my own department. And so if you're one of these doctors, including this one who's driven the equivalent of 90,000 miles, maybe you'd think about, well, geez, maybe I can be doing a better job. And so really important to communicate with staff. And again, compared to a relatable measure, for example, miles or kilometers driven. Next slide, please. And so the ASA has, for several years now, this inhaled anesthetic challenge. Reduce your facility inhaled anesthetic greenhouse gas emissions, we propose, by 50%, because if you haven't started on this journey yet, you can easily get to 50% waste reduction with these measures. And just to reiterate these recommendations, some are easier to enact today than others. Utilize fresh gas flows. Avoid high impact anesthetics, Desrain and nitrous oxide. Decommission centralized nitrous oxide pipelines. That's harder to do, but is important. Hopefully that has struck you. Consider intravenous and regional techniques when feasible and safe. For those institutions participating in the Thrive study, that's a great opportunity to help transform culture. I know a lot of places use primarily TIVA. I am only one of 2 providers at my institution who primarily does TIVA. Then consider the waste gas capturing destruction technology, but only after all the aforementioned. Next slide. I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Any questions for Dr. Sherman? We can also move it to lunch and have questions there. Okay. Questions?
Social stress from Groningen. What about the fresh gas flow when you're doing TIVA? There are some debates about that too.
Yes, thank you for that question. And that was one slide at the last minute. I'm like, oh, I forgot to put that one in. The lower flow